I'd like to say thank you to Pat McDonald for allowing us to use the Orca station for this panel discussion that we will be having today. And today's panel discussion is on healthcare. And with us we have Lauren Chupan, Meg Hansen, who also is running for lieutenant governor under the Republican ticket in Vermont, and we have Gail Graham, retired nurse?
Yes.
Retired nurse. Good. Thank you. So what we'll do is we'll go through our questions, and as I said earlier, I'll ask one of you to respond, and then the other two can either add in or debate what they've heard. But I'd like to take a moment and just go around and have you introduce yourself a little bit deeper than just your name or what I said. And we'll start with you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Deb. My name is Lawrence Zupan. I've been a lifelong student of what works in the political sphere. With regard to healthcare and insurance, of course, I'm a consumer like most people. I've also employed people and paid for the health insurance of my employees. I have an MBA, and a year and a half ago, I found it necessary to become a little more educated about healthcare when I ran for the U.S. Senate here in Vermont against Bernie Sanders. I also ought to say I'm honored to be on the panel with Meg Hansen, whom I know to be a person who's been engaged lifelong in the healthcare industry, and who hopefully will be our next lieutenant governor.
Wonderful. Meg?
Thanks for that, Lawrence. Thank you for having us on your panel, Deb. I'm running for lieutenant governor this year. I am the former executive director of Vermonters for Healthcare Freedom. That is a small health policy think tank, and I have a background in medicine. I'm trained in medicine.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I am a retired nurse, and also my last job in California was a legal nurse consultant investigating cases for hospitals that were self-insured for their liability insurance. And also I am a consumer of health care and Medicare.
I'm always so honored to be sitting amongst so much talent. So let's get started here. One of the things that we hear over and over and over again is healthcare is a right. How do we unpack that? Let's talk about how do we unpack that. And Meg, we'll start with you.
That's actually a really, really important point. And my answer to that is healthcare freedom is a right, because all freedoms are rights. We have a right as Vermonters, as Americans, as citizens or we should be able to choose the health care, whether it's health insurance or a doctor or a hospital, that we feel is best for ourselves and our families. Whether it's cost or access, quality, that's the freedom that we have, health care freedom. When you talk about health care as a good or service and say that's a right, that means you're saying you have a right to someone else's time, someone else's knowledge, and someone else's labor, and you have a right to taxpayer money, someone else's money, which you don't.
Good.
I
Lawrence,
think that's extremely and succinctly well put. I would add that, well, if you want to make healthcare a right, meaning that, as Meg so eloquently stated, that you have the right to presume upon other people's resources, well, why stop at healthcare? You know, why not make childcare, vacations, resorts? Why not make everything a right and ask the government to take over responsibility for everything you do? Of course, it's satirical to put it that way, but you know, we've been moving, unfortunately, in that direction. And we also have observed that when it comes to dispensing goods and services, the United States government, with all due respect, may not be the most efficient dispenser of goods and services. I'll stop there for the moment.
Good. Gail, would you like to add anything to that?
I described it very, very well, and Meg, particularly, I like and both of you. I was involved with Vermonters for Healthcare Freedom when it was initiated, and so, like being at the State House, and of course I was there just to gather information, but seeing these banners and waving flags and everything, it's by right, and you explained it both very well. It's
So just to add to that, Deb, see, why are we talking about healthcare as a right? It's because they've created, and this is from the left, right, especially from the far left, you've created a right that they say government will give you. It's not the way that our founding fathers talked about rights. It was God-given rights. But this is a government-given right. So if government is going to give it to you, then government is the best person to then nationalize 1/6 of our economy, which is healthcare, and then give you that right. So I see this whole talk about rights as a rhetorical game that's played by progressives to pave the way for single payer. That's really what it is.
And any government that is strong enough to give you such a monumental right as sweeping health care is also strong enough to deprive you of it. And while Meg correctly states that it's 1/6 of our economy now, within the next 5 or 6 years, it'll probably be 1/5 of our national economy at the rate of increase of expenditure for health care.
Right. Good point. Good point. And I also think that if you treat it as a right from the government, eventually many will be deprived
Well,
in the end.
we've seen where centralized planning, collectivist planning by government, actually results, when it pertains to food, it results in starvation. So when it results in health care, it's going to result in a lot of sick people dying in the streets.
Right.
I mean, you know, the unfortunate, very contemporary example of the most wealthy country in South America, previously only 10, 15 years ago, descending to the point where their middle-class people, even their doctors and lawyers, are starving for food because of the collectivist system and the inefficiencies built into it and the corruption built into it. We got to ask ourselves, why would we want to listen to the siren song of collectivism to be brought here? I mean, the happy fact is that the fertile seedbed of liberty is what has given rise to a healthcare system on the positive side, which is still the envy of the world, even though there are things that definitely need to be improved, and there are things we can learn from other countries. But 80% of the research and the new drugs and devices that have emerged to help sick people and solve problems that seemed insoluble have emerged from the brilliance and entrepreneurial genius of American researchers. Why? Because they're free to do so, and they're free to be rewarded for their work.
Right. Exactly. Good. Wonderful. Let's move on to Vermont. Faces two major monopolies in the healthcare system. The UVM hospital network, and we've all enjoyed that, and then the Blue Cross Blue Shield in healthcare. What are the consequences of this? Gail?
This concerns me a great deal. First of all, when I moved back here to Vermont from California about 12 years ago, I was amazed to find out that there were only two health insurance companies. It was also a Blue Cross, Blue Shield, and an MVP. And I'm like, what? I mean,
What's up with
well,
that?
I've been involved long now I know, and I think it's a good example. Lack of competition, the two companies, and now we have Network, One Care involved, and which leads to another subject, which I have opinions about. I think we'll talk about in a bit probably. But the lack of competition, I think, is a major one.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the happy friction in our society caused by the sandpaper of competition refines the products, the goods, the services being offered by the companies that offer it. If you have one monopoly sitting there fat and happy, which is not prodded by a competitor to improve their product, to innovate, to lower their price, they're just going to offer and you take what you get. On the other hand, if we threw open the gates to competition here in Vermont and said, you 10 insurers, come on in and make your bids, oh boy, we'd see what you see everywhere, there's competition. We'd see new innovation. We'd see, instead of shoddy products and services, we'd see sharper, more personalized ones that respond to the needs of Vermonters. We'd see lower prices.
Lower prices.
All of those benefits. Competition is as American as Mother Apple Pie and the American flag.
Absolutely.
But why do we have that? Why do we have a monopoly? Right? So Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, which is known as Obamacare, gives financial and regulatory incentives to consolidate. They call it quote, to integrate across the continuum of care. So doctors, clinics, hospitals, especially hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance companies are given incentives to consolidate, because the argument was, according to the architects of Obamacare, that this would cut costs and streamline care. Of course, it hasn't done that, because by design, monopolies, as everyone has talked about, decreases competition, and that affects quality and increases prices. So how has it affected Vermonters? Well, healthcare costs are through the roof. Right? The same thing with well, 2/3 of Americans get insurance, health insurance, through their employers, whereas and then the rest is in the individual market. In Vermont, the individual and small group markets are merged, and in that, Blue Cross Blue Shield has a 90% monopoly, and MVP of Albany, New York, is 10%. And we see annual double-digit increases in the premiums. The same reason why, it's because it's a monopoly. But the thing is, it's designed though. You know, it's not as if, oh, why isn't there no competition? There used to be more insurance companies, they all left. That's because Vermont, the legislature, imposes the strictest regulations when it comes to how to price premiums, for example. The whole thing about Obamacare, if we get into that, is a misunderstanding of what is health insurance. Health insurance, just like any insurance, is a business of risk prediction, right? In health insurance, we pay small periodic payments to protect ourselves from future catastrophe, some unforeseen event that will cost a lot of money. That's the whole point of health insurance. Now, human beings are not cars, I understand that, but just for the sake of an analogy, when we have car insurance, it's not for oil changes. When we have homeowners insurance, it's not for changing light bulbs, right? That's routine maintenance, that's different. So in the same way, when you're deciding on a premium, you've got to look at the risk. That's called a risk rating. And Obamacare changed that, made insurance comprehensive health coverage. So now you have 10 benefits that every plan must have. Otherwise, they call it junk insurance. So a 22-year-old guy has to now buy a plan that has maternity care. Why would he want to do that? All these things cause premiums to increase. And another point, it's sort of technical, but it's important to understand, and that is moving from a risk rating to something called a community rating, where if I'm the insurance company and I have to decide the premiums, I can't do it on the base of risk. I have to do it on the base of like age and health and other factors. So Obamacare made it a rule to say that, let's say if there's a 20-year-old and a 60-year-old, and I'm gonna decide the premiums, the difference from the highest to the lowest premium the ratio can't be more than 3:1. So you limit that. But in Vermont, it is 1:1, a community rating 1:1. So as an insurance company, if I can't differentiate my premiums between a 20-year-old and a 60-year-old, how can I, obviously a 60-year-old on average is going to consume more health services. So that's why everyone's left. So you see, people always talk about, oh, well, why don't we have more people? Well, we do have more people, but the way that the system is designed with Vermont Health Exchange, that's the name, right? The Vermont Health Connect, Vermont Health Connect, the name of our exchange. The way that it's designed, the way that the rules have been imposed, along with Obamacare, it's for consolidation, for monopolies. I always say this, it's a difference between serving ideology versus serving individuals. If you wanted to serve individuals, there are many ways to, purchase insurance across state lines. Whatever you think of the Trump administration, last year they gave exit ramps from this clogged highway. So there's association health plans, short-term, limited duration plans, just plans for catastrophic events. There's so many ways to get the premiums down. There's so many ways to have individual practices and have little clinics so that people have choice and option. But Obamacare and the way the system is created incentivizes UVM to buy up all the practices in the Northwest, and now it's coming down to southern Vermont, my neck of the woods. The system is designed to do that. That's what happens.
So were the off ramps that you just referred to?
Yeah.
Are they not available to Vermont?
Yeah, they're not available. They're available to all Americans, but not to Vermonters.
That's why we live here, right? Gail, I saw you wanted to add something to that
I'm
conversation?
I totally agree with everything that Meg is saying, and Could I talk about OneCare at this point? A lot of people are aware of what OneCare is.
For those that are not, could you just quickly?
Yes, it's designed, I'll try to make it simple and explain it. It's originally designed by UVM, the UVM network. And my first awareness was when it first started, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, because my primary physician was part of Central Vermont Hospital. And so he mentioned it to me. Actually, quite honestly, he didn't really know what it was at the time because it hadn't been adequately explained to the providers. And I said, oh, sure, okay, fine, whatever. Well, once we got into it, I started finding out what it was. It's managed care. And I am very familiar with managed care because I was a legal nurse consultant in California, and back the managed care HMOs pretty much started there. And I investigated cases where bad things happened, and I learned a lot. I couldn't understand, for instance, why a patient didn't receive a consultation that should have. And finally, with talking to people and everything, I found out it was because of managed care. How managed care works is they reduce the amount of care that you received. Like here, initially with OneCare, all of a sudden I couldn't even get a complete blood study annually. Couldn't get a chest x-ray because it wasn't necessary. And to me, that's kind of like a medicine 101. And also my physician at the time, who was a wonderful man, a wonderful physician, quite frankly, sadly, I saw his practice of medicine decline because he was restricted on what he could do and couldn't do for his patients. Cut to the chase, the less care that managed care gives to patients, the more that stays in their coffers, management. If I explained it,
Yeah. Yep.
because a lot of people don't understand, and the sad thing is, most people I'm talking to today are not aware of what, they have no idea what OneCare is. I was talking to my neighbors a couple weeks ago. One thing led to another. They didn't realize that they are part of OneCare because it hasn't been explained to them.
So we all know what happened in 2011, right? When then Governor Shumlin tried to enact single payer. It was known as Act 48. Then they did some honest number crunching, and what they realized is that it's not feasible. Why? Because in the model, when they looked at the model, the annual cost growth of the model exceeded the annual GDP of Vermont. And so the model broke because you can't sustain it, right? You don't have enough money. So just before he left, fall of 2016, Shumlin signed a contract with, then it was the Obama administration, to start a new experiment. It's called the all-payer model, as Gail was talking about, which is single payer 2.0. And the idea here is that when she talks about managed care, basically, and an HMO, as people know, now it's called, the 2.0 version is called ACO, or Accountable Care Organization, which is just an umbrella term under which all the hospitals, practices, everybody works under that particular umbrella. And it's run by a private entity called OneCare Vermont. So we have something called a ACO all-payer model, and that's what we're looking at right now. And the idea is to show that costs are contained. You have to show that. So they said the objective is to save money. It hasn't saved any money, but they think it's a success, and a lot of Republicans have also bought into that by seeing that every year we're containing the costs. We're keeping the costs down. How do you contain costs?
reduce services.
Exactly. That's exactly what she's talking about. It's called rationing. And so when I was with Vermonters for Healthcare Freedom, we did an original investigation, and I have statistics to show that the use of primary care physicians have gone down. The use of specialty physicians has gone down. But it's not like we're all healthier, because the health quality indicators have worsened, and we have enough anecdotal evidence of long waiting lines. The way that you prevent costs from increasing is by refusing care. That's what she's talking about, not giving an MRI, not giving CT scan, and that is seen as a success. So this is what happens when you have socialized systems where someone is, as Lauren said, where someone's planning. You can't take into consideration all the various market forces. You're always going to fall short. And if the bottom line is to just contain costs, we as Vermonters suffer.
Well said.
Interesting. So, just to add on to this, my primary is in the UVM network. And as we age, we need more services and timely services and so forth. And what I discovered in the last year or so is that I would be sick and I would call in, and unless you're on the floor, your appointment is 6 weeks out, unless you want to see a PA. And I've always been of the mindset, I pay a doctor, I want to see a doctor.
Yeah.
And I know that there are people. So what I ended up doing was I engaged a concierge doctor. So I have a concierge on top of my primary. That's not really a liked situation, I discovered, by the primary care system, but I live with it. And it's the only way that I can see a doctor tomorrow, today, if I'm sick. Because the average doctor, I understand, has 2,000 patients. The concierge doctors cap out at 600. Mine happens to have 300. But it's that quality of service. Not everyone can do that.
Right.
And so people are getting left behind and not getting the medical care in a timely manner.
So Deb, what you're saying is perfect, because this is a two-tier system. And in every single nation that Bernie Sanders refers to, they have this two-tier system. It's always the poor, the low-income people who get stuck with the government crappy system because they can't get out of it. And everyone who has more money goes to private hospitals and a private system. This happens everywhere. The UK, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, and the VA, because we actually do have single payer here.
Yeah.
We actually have nationalized
VA.
single payer here. And in that, 2/3 of veterans don't use it. 1/3 of veterans who use it get 75% of their treatment elsewhere, even though they have to pay more. So really the only people who actually use the VA are people who can't afford to get it anywhere
So
else.
the only model we have is a failed model.
The
Yes.
failed VA
Yes.
model, which
Yes.
brings us to the point that the American government, with its obligation to the 19 million most deserving citizens who've put their lives on the line for the country, the vets, are getting substandard services and treatment. In fact, I know someone who needed an acute heart surgery right away. The VA said, sorry, you have to wait. Waiting would have meant death. He had to go to another state, borrow and raise and beg $150,000, this Marine veteran, so that he could get the life-saving surgery he needed. This is the service and the thing we want to bring, not only for 19 million Americans, but for 330 million Americans. We want to bring substandard service. I don't think that that's the answer.
So what is the mindset of those that want to go in that direction? What are they thinking?
No.
How do they think it works?
Well, I'm not
What's
sure how
driving them?
deeply, with all due respect to Senator Sanders, who's the prime promoter of Medicare for All, I don't think he's thinking really deeply. I think what he is thinking, and what has been his prime motivation, and what is his core belief, is that government truly should collect all of the resources and assets of a country and redistribute the goods and services according to its munificence and its wisdom. I think he's a true believer in the communist socialist model. Despite all the evidence staring the world in its face that that model has failed miserably, has resulted in 100 million deaths in the 20th century, in this decade is resulting, in this year is resulting in the abject failure of a modern second or first world state called Venezuela. Every place socialism has been tried, everywhere it's been tried, the command collectivist model is a disaster. And let us ask ourselves, why is that? Because there is a truth about human nature which those who favor socialism just really want to ignore. And that is that people love to work and do their best and receive the rewards and the fruit of their labor. And receiving the rewards for your labor is not a dirty word. Profit is not a dirty word. There's another three-letter word that's become dirty. It's called progressive, which used to be a really good word until it was applied as a euphemism for socialism and communism. But the reason that we have been the leader in healthcare in the world, and that the whole world looks up to us for everything we've provided with our ingenious research, a lot of which I'm going to detail in a moment when we get to that phase of the conversation, is because, as I said, our country has this fertile seedbed of liberty where people can start up new ideas, they can fulfill their dreams. There's a woman who was just an ordinary woman whose daughter was diagnosed with an incurable lung disease, which has a death rate of almost 100%. Instead of saying, oh, well, I'll just wait for her to die, she put her life on hold. This was not a doctor. She studied all of the volumes about it. She changed it into language she could understand. She read the high school and college textbooks, never mind. And then she developed, using the convergent technologies which are available now in the 21st century, she developed through using CRISPR gene editing, through using 3D modeling, through using genetic coding, she developed a way to solve the problem for her daughter of this incurable, according to doctors, lung disease, so that now thousands of people's lives have been saved. And this is an ordinary American with more than the average amount of drive and go-getter who solved this problem. And this is the kind of thing that's happening all over America now, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little while. But why would we want to relinquish the freedom and the liberty which has given rise to all of the great solutions we're already enjoying in the name of a socialism which is a wet blanket on creativity, socialism which is a wet blanket on innovation, socialism which is a wet blanket on really finding solutions? Yeah. We don't. We really don't.
Yeah. And I'm not even 100% convinced that Bernie Sanders believes what he says. First of all, he can't figure out how to pay for it, and he'll openly say that. And second of all, I think in order to get to where he wants to be, he has to use buzzwords. And that's what the game is.
That's perfect, because you know what? It's the fact that he says Medicare for all when it actually is VA for all. But the VA doesn't have a good reputation. Medicare does. So this is a focus group tested buzzword.
Yep.
And so that, to me, betrays his naked will to power. That's what I really think is his deal.
He always has lived off other people's backs. Excuse me.
Well,
I'd like to go on with what Larry was saying, and just, I'm old. I graduated from nurses training at Mary Hitchcock in Hanover, New Hampshire in '59. Over all of these years, I have seen progress in medicine just is outstanding, going along with what Lawrence is saying. It breaks my heart to think that medicine is where it is, and what Lawrence was talking about, all the advances that have been made, potentially are just going by the wayside with what we're talking about. Another thing I wanted to mention too is why do people from Canada come down to the United States, like particularly UVM, for like heart surgery and so on and so forth?
Because they don't have to wait 21 weeks and then call their funeral director instead of the hospital.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So,
Lawrence, you said that that U.S. healthcare is the envy of the world, right? That's a fact, because not only are we light years ahead of every other so-called comparable nation, we have the best recovery rates for all cancers, prevalent ones and rare ones. We have, so chronic disease-wise, you know, it's because of high blood pressure. We have the best prognosis rates for that as well. So, and we also carry the burden of medical innovation for pharmaceutical, you know, whether it's drugs or technology, imaging, everything. U.S. taxpayers pay for drugs that everybody else uses.
Right.
And so when we look at all these facts, it's shocking that somebody like Bernie Sanders and his acolytes hate on the best system, the gold standard. We're the gold standard, and use spurious, dubious facts like saying we have a worse infant mortality rate and we have poor life expectancy. These are two things that they always say. They say, oh, we spend so much money, but our health outcomes are poor. That's actually not true at all. It's not true at all. I'll just quickly say it. If you look at homicide deaths, gunshot wounds, and motorcycle deaths, motor vehicle deaths, those are the two factors that skew and make our life expectancy shorter than everything else, because that's a big factor. But when you remove that, we're similar to everything else. And as far as infant mortality rate is concerned, in the US, every baby that is born, if it shows any sign of life, like one breath, one heartbeat, one voluntary movement, is considered to be a live birth, and it's considered when you calculate infant mortality. But in France, Germany, Austria, if the baby is less than 500 grams, it's considered unsalvageable and not considered a live birth. In other countries, if the baby doesn't survive 24 hours, not considered a live birth. So the statistics are so skewed. You can't use that, and you can't use these, cherry-picking crap just to say that the United States is
justify
bad.
your
We're
argument.
actually really good. We are the envy of the world.
Wonderful. Well, very good. Great conversation. Lawrence, this is for you. What are some of the developments in the field of healthcare which are on the immediate horizon for America?
I'm so glad you asked that because, in the midst of all of the gloom and doom, and in the midst of all the challenges to America's greatness and what we've accomplished, and the legitimate problems that do have to be solved, and we should talk more perhaps about healthcare costs and what could be done about it, we have a great new reality to the healthcare situation. Why do I say this? Am I just being Pollyannish and just saying everything's wonderful, relax? No. We have what's called convergent technologies that are happening at a very high level because of the technical realities. We have quantum computing, which has multiplied by millions the number of computations per second that a computer can do. So if you are, for example, sampling different types of drug solutions, and you have a computer that can operate thousands and millions of times faster, there's so much more information you can process, so many more things you can put aside that don't work until you get to the solution. We have the genome. The genome is the map of the DNA of a body. And because of that, and originally it cost $1 million and took 10 years, now it costs a couple $100 and it can be done in a couple of days. Pretty soon it'll cost less than the cost of washing a dish in your sink, just to map the whole genome of the human body. Why is this important? You take the map of a genome, you take all of the amazing new sensors that are coming out of Silicon Valley that measure every impulse and every bit of blood chemistry from your body, and look at your DNA, the ability to diagnose diseases before they happen or at the very earliest stages mean that we can not only produce healthier people, but we can add to longevity and we can drive down the cost of health care, because prevention and early diagnosis is so much better than cure. Let me just give you a few exciting examples. This is stuff that, it's going on in the last 60, 90 days, these things. And by the way, all of the developments that used to take years, the new breakthroughs are taking weeks or days and months. How about this? How about a handheld MRI? Think about that. Right now, hospitals, millions of dollars, have this room all sealed off from every place else, and special technicians, and 3/4 of the world can't get MRIs because of this. How about a handheld MRI that pretty soon will be ubiquitously available to everyone, never mind only all Americans, but because of American ingenuity, it'll be available everywhere in the world. How about a handheld ultrasound to measure the healing in your body, to check on the fetus developing in your body that you could have and utilize from your own home because it only costs $50 to $100. How about something called, right now we have something called STAR, which is Soft Tissue Autonomous Robot. We have these surgical robots that are so much more accurate than surgeons with so many fewer mistakes and infections. And this kind of artificial intelligence in a robot is transforming the surgical theater. We have something called microscopic robots. Think about this is sci-fi come to life. A microscopic robot that is programmed with just the right amount of medicine that moves at 60 centimeters a minute through the body, and the doctor watching delivers the precise medical payload to the exact location in the body that it's needed. This is what's available now. How about something called GP Write, which is enabling through the genome, which is the map of your DNA, an individual's DNA, to grow transplantable organs. Think of how many people die waiting for kidneys and hearts and lungs right now. It's reachable in the next few years that needs for new organs is going to be more something to manage rather than to bury the poor, unhappy people who never got them. So when you combine the stem cells, genomics, CRISPR gene editing, 3D printing, the incredible sensors that are coming out of Silicon Valley, all of the big four are Google, Amazon, Apple, are all dedicated. Tim Scott, whatever the CEO of Apple recently said, what do you think Apple is going to be remembered for 50 years from now? He said, healthcare. All the tremendous assets of the most successful company in American history, because of the little handheld device, they're going to be remembered for healthcare. They're already magnifying the capabilities with their handheld sensor devices. And again, I just want to say that all of these amazing technologies, which I just scratched the surface of, I could talk about it for half an hour, and I would only be giving a summary of 1/10 of what is knowable today. All of it has become available because of the American system, of the seedbed of liberty, which is the American system, so that all these brilliant scientists can look at a problem and say, I can find the solution, and now I have all these convergent technologies which overlap and each build synergistically one upon another to do things that 5-10 years ago and even today would be considered unimaginable. This is going to drive down the cost of health care throughout the country. It's going to raise the level of health of every American, and it's going to be a complete revolution in our system. So what should we do about it besides exult in this? If I was in Governor Scott's inner circle, I would say, Governor Scott, we should lead. What we should do is you should take 2 or 3 people that you trust, send them to the biotech corridor in Massachusetts, invite those companies to open up a branch here in Vermont, give them a 5-year tax abatement in return for most favored nation status, so-called, for Vermont citizens. So when the fruits of your biotechnical research come to fruition and become actualized, Vermonters get a discounted rate to benefit from those technologies. What would we have? We'd have new great companies coming here who are cutting edge in the health and biotech field. We'd have first dibs on the fruits of their research. We'd have new energy and vitality pouring into our state. These are the kinds of solutions that, and I think I'd love to talk more about it with Meg once she becomes Lieutenant Governor, because she'd be very influential in it, and it's right in her wheelhouse of concern. These are the kinds of solutions that we need to embrace the tremendous possibilities we have to go further and faster and farther than we ever imagined in this year and this decade. I could go on, but I'll stop now.
Well, that was amazing, right? Meg, would
Yes.
you like to add anything? Gail?
Totally amazing, yes. And it was interesting discussion, and it's so true. And it goes along with kind of like what I was talking about earlier, what I've seen, the improvement in medicine over multi-years. And I'll add something that people are often apt to say, oh, it all costs so much, I wouldn't do that. But you know what? They change their tune when it's them or somebody in their family that needs the advanced health care.
Yeah, well said.
On that, I'm going to share a statistic. There was a and this is very important, it kind of ties everything together, I think. In 2002, there was a German study that showed that 56% of Americans who have high blood pressure were using the latest statins. Statins are a group of drugs that bring down cholesterol. So 56% of Americans were using that. And in comparison, in Europe, 17 to 36% of Europeans had access to it. The second thing is, when it comes to antipsychotic drugs, 60% of Americans who needed it had access to the newest generation. And it's important, I'm going to just say that the newest generation of antipsychotic drugs have lesser side effects. That's basically, the older ones have a lot of debilitating side effects, such as depression, for example. It kind of complicates the underlying pathology. So 60% of Americans had access to the latest antipsychotic drugs. 10% of Europeans have access to that because they have price controls, because they want to contain costs. It's another form of rationing, whereas the average American has access to, per capita, the most number of MRI machines, CT scans. We already have that, so having more technology and innovation, as Lawrence talked about, would just make it better. We have access to the latest medicine, and we have it instantly. And this is because our regulatory atmosphere does not have so many burdens as European or Canadian or Canada or other countries have. So this whole thing about medical innovation and moving in new directions can only happen as long as we protect innovation by getting rid of or preventing more regulations. In a single payer system or any form of nationalized healthcare, we would lose all that overnight.
I agree. And in talking, Meg reminded me of one of these amazing diagnostic systems, which I left off the list a moment ago. If I'd like to share with you. This one group has developed a 3-hour annual scan, a system that scans your entire genome, your DNA, your cardiac, your lungs, your blood, does a complete toe-to-head internal diagnosis of everything about your body, and it does it for a moderate price now. But the really exciting thing is that this complete stem-to-stern diagnosis will soon be available for you to perform at home on your own. Just think about that. And there's another system that is, the CRISPR gene editor has determined that there's one set of diseases, there's one set of mismatch of chromosomes and genes that is probably responsible for 32,000 diseases. So that by CRISPR gene editing and fixing those chromosomes that are currently mismatched, the potential is there through gene editing to wipe out 16,000 diseases. So these are the kinds of amazing things that are on the threshold. But also, touching on cost containment, I have another suggestion which might be a little, a little controversial. People wonder why costs are so great in the U.S. Other nations are bragging about their lower costs. Of course, as Meg has outlined, they are piggybacking all of the research, the work, the development of product we have done. But how about this? We know that Medicare and the state Medicaid agencies are not allowed to negotiate prices. I don't know about you, but I grew up with a Jewish mother. If I ever bought anything without negotiating, she would have spanked me and sent me back to my room. But you don't have to have a Jewish mother to know that if you can't negotiate prices, you're going to pay through the nose. That's just the way life is. So Medicare, which provides such a high percentage of the medication to American citizenry, and state Medicaid agencies are not allowed to negotiate. How about this for a radical idea? We know that the European Union and other nations are allowed, they do, vigorously and rigorously negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies here. I think we should consider a rule that whatever the pharmaceutical companies sell to the EU, those medications, they have to sell to our own American citizens at the same price. Thank you very much. That's my idea. And I think it ought to be looked at. Now, I say that even though I'm not a fan normally of price controls, but when you consider that it's America is the biggest customer and it's our ratepayer, taxpayer that is subsidizing and supporting those pharmaceutical companies, Why should other nations get the benefit of a lower cost when we pay through the nose? I'm sorry, that's not going to continue. We need to talk to those pharmaceutical companies and say, okay, you want to sell it to EU for $1? You're not selling it to us for $1.50. You have to match whatever you sell to them for America. Just an idea.
I want to disagree a little bit with Lawrence. So the way that it works is that our U.S. drug supply chain is very convoluted, and it definitely needs reform. And there is something known as an invisible middleman, or pharmacy benefit managers. For example, CVS has Caremark, and they. So a normal supply chain would be, let's say Coca-Cola, for example. There's a manufacturing unit, and then they ship the product to the retail store, and then the consumer goes and buys it, and then some of the money's kept by the retailer, and then goes to the wholesale. Well, that's not how it works for a drug supply chain, because the drugs that are made by the pharmaceutical companies are then given to the pharmacies, but we have something called a third payer system, where a third payer system in our healthcare, where Medicaid, Medicare, TRICARE, VA, and employers are the ones paying our healthcare purchases. We don't go to the store and just buy a product. It's mostly covered by insurance, especially drugs. So we have a third party managing the payment. So there's a disconnect between the consumer and the person who's actually selling it. And so the pharmacy benefit manager negotiates with the pharmaceutical company and gets rebates, secretive rebates that we don't know about, kickbacks. And depending on the deals that they cut, the drug goes up or down a list. It's called a formulary, whether it's third tier, fourth tier, 1, 2, or 3. And if they make a good deal, it goes up. If it goes to the top tier of Medicare, that means Medicare will cover most of the costs, and the consumer will only cover like a little bit in the copay. But if they don't make a good deal, it'll be at the bottom of the list, or maybe not on the list, and then the consumer has to pay a lot. So it's basically backroom deals. It's very, very convoluted. The Trump administration has called, at least it said, that they wanted to eliminate the middlemen altogether, but lobbyists, pressure, the cycle of DC, so they remain. But I would say that you have to audit them, demand transparency, and say, okay, well, if the list price of a particular drug is so high, what percentage is going into the pockets of the middleman? What percentage is going to, as sort of a bribe to Medicare, Medicaid, and all those places? There's a lot, it's very, very complicated, and that would be the way to reform it. We can't, price controls are bad, because price controls, that's basic economics 101. When you stop the price, artificially stop the price of something, you risk drying up the supply of the product. And European nations put these price controls and dry up the supply, which is why, as I said in that study, only 10% of Europeans had access to the newest generation of antipsychotic drugs, and this was back in 2002. There's a disconnect between, we can't have those price controls. That would not work. Having price controls also jeopardizes bringing a drug to market. It's always a big risk and a gamble to develop a new drug. It takes $1 billion to bring it to market. And if you have a price control, it's a type of a regulation that would also stop people from taking that risk, because it's high risk, high reward. So
I agree that disincentivizing the industry by controlling what they can charge for the product that they've invested $1 billion in has a price to pay. I think that this has to be studied. I know it's true that for every 5,000 drugs brought to market, only 5 of them reach human trials, and only 1 of them actually succeeds in reaching the market. So I know that the pharmaceutical research investment is staggeringly large, and I don't begrudge them recovering their investment and making a profit. That's the American way. I do believe, though, that it has to be studied what is the basis for continuing to sell to every place else in the world for a lower price than we sell to our American counterparts here. So I think I heard all of Meg's points, and I think they're very valid. I think this issue deserves more study.
Okay, great. I'd like to move on to another topic here. Our clock is ticking here. And I'm going to jump down to the opioid discussion. It's one of the things that I think is very detrimental to the health and welfare of our entire nation. And the Vermont legislators are considering radical measures to deal with the opioid epidemic, such as creating safe injection sites and decriminalizing
Buprenorphine, yeah.
buprenorphine.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on these proposals?
Sure, why not? Oh, sorry.
Gail?
Yes, the opioid crisis is critical, and it's a huge concern, and especially that per capita here in Vermont, I think we have one of the largest issues for many reasons. As for the safe site injections, I have mixed feelings, I have to admit, about that. As far as if they're going to injecting safely definitely is an issue. Then you go to, does it promote them injecting? That's, who knows? I think that if there's some way, if they have these sites, that there's counseling, that it's not just a thing like going into the drugstore and, injecting. I feel that there should be organized, and as I say, these people need help one way or another, and it's not an easy fix. We know that, but I really think that more needs to be more concentration on trying to help these people sincerely.
Yeah, I wonder, and this is not my area, field, my wheelhouse at all, but I wonder, we talk about safe injection sites and decriminalizing this and decriminalizing that, and we're looking at commercialization of marijuana and all the other things that are happening. And yet we know that we have a real social problem with drugs here. Are we giving enough attention to the core causes of what's going on here? Or are we just Band-Aiding everything?
It's worse than a Band-Aid. It's actually an implicit and tacit, or direct and explicit, sanction and approval of highly self-destructive behavior. So having said that, what are the solutions? Education, treatment, therapies, law enforcement, and this may seem a little subtle, but the revitalization of the primacy of the American family. The destruction of the primacy of the American family is one of the causal factors in the rampant epidemic of drug use worldwide, and in this country in particular. Why was it not a problem so much before the 60s when the breakdown of the family occurred? But so coming back to it, where have we seen the real solutions? Where have we seen the successes that we can point to and exalt as something to be replicated, multiplied, and duplicated?
Where have we seen them?
Well, I'm about to tell you. We've seen them with Turning Point USA in Rutland. We've seen it with Teen Pack, where they have a 65% success rate. With recovery, there's a group called Recovery House. All of these people are effective. All these groups are effective. Why? Because ultimately, the solution to a drug addiction is a personal transformation. A personal transformation. And that's what's available in an intensive recovery situation. And I think these results and these successes are what we must build upon. At the same time, disincentivizing our police from arresting drug dealers is crazy, psychotic behavior on a governmental level, and it has to be reversed immediately. So that's all I have to say for now.
So do you think that the numbers of deaths from overdose in Vermont are being properly reported to the public? Someone had told me recently that they were involved in that level of information, and that we are not really hearing all of the death rates that are occurring for whatever reasons, maybe because it might affect legislation coming forward.
You mean related to cannabis commercialization?
Drug use, yes.
Oh, okay.
Drug use.
Or just an overall?
Just drug use.
Well,
yeah.
we know that
Overdose.
the amount of tetrahydrocannabinol in today's marijuana is not the same small amount in the marijuana that Bill Clinton didn't inhale.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, that was like 3%, now it's 30%. The strength of these drugs, I'm told by those who know these things, is mind-bogglingly stronger. And to have people under these influences driving cars with no way for police to measure their intoxication or inability to control themselves is just a formula for more carnage on the highways, more lives ruined. We need to back away from this rush to not only, okay, we know it's been legalized, but to commercialize it, put a stamp of approval on it by the government, and then thereby all of our kids in school say, well, it's legal and sold by the government, must be okay, let's do it. We can't. We got exactly going 180-degree opposite direction. We need to educate our parents. We need to educate our schools. We need to educate our kids. We need to show them what it looks like to be stoned all the time. Just like we now have videos and movies that show kids all kinds of things in school, let's show them what it looks like to ruin your life on drugs before you do it.
The purpose of the two policies that you talked about, I think the way that they position it is harm reduction, you know? So substitute OxyContin for buprenorphine, for example, or prevent people from getting STDs and other, you know, diseases that are transmitted by dirty needles. But I think we have to just question, do you really want that? I mean, do you think that short-term harm reduction, the way that they're putting it, is really the solution? This goes beyond health policy, as you talked about, in terms of understanding, you know, we have a culture of despair, we have a culture of death, and yes, family, as Lawrence talked, was important. Also work, you know, outside of personal relationships, work gives people meaning, right? So restoring the value of work and the dignity of labor, that's one of the factors that in terms of education and outreach and counseling, we can help. Because people say, well, you can go to get detox and rehab, but then you relapse. Well, you won't relapse if you have meaning in your life, and work is a great way of doing that. And so we can have, I think Mike Rowe does that. You know, he has this great foundation, and he talks about, it's not just about going to college and doing a liberal arts degree. You can have apprenticeships, you can go to technical schools and in the trades, and you can really find your purpose and meaning, and, you know, get off drugs.
I mean, this legislation that they're proposing, it's not original. You want to look at the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco?
Colorado.
That's what we can have in Colorado. That's what we could have here in Burlington and Rutland. Do you really want that, legislators? I don't think so.
So why are they driven toward that those legislative acts and approving them?
It's always hard to ascribe motivation because it implies that you know what's going on between someone else's ears. I have to admit, I don't always know exactly what's going on between my own. However, if you're going to ask me, I'll give you an educated opinion. I think there's, in the certain subculture that was spawned in the 60s, that are the parents of those people who are legislators today, or perhaps they are, there's this notion that, you know, drugs just aren't so really bad after all. And we have to live and let live, and it's part of the culture, and there's something good about it. It's a subculture that they believe has some redeeming qualities. Now, they may not come out and say that, but I think that they believe that. And they believe that opposing drugs is somehow too restrictive for the free lifestyles that they propose. So that's my taking a shot at what their motivations are. Although I admit it's hard to know, because if you look at the evidence in Colorado, the people in Colorado, they're trying to warn us not to be Colorado. The LA streets, 60,000 homeless, needles that you step on everywhere, and other things you don't want to step in all over the place. In San Francisco, the two most prosperous cities formerly, or maybe still, in California, become third world subsets of what they once were.
They're the results of liberal policies that have
Because
occurred.
when you supply those needles and when you supply those safe, whatever, guess what? It becomes a magnet, and you draw people from other places to come and avail themselves of these wonderful facilities.
Sure.
I think it's exactly the wrong direction.
What confuses me a little bit, and we're almost out of time here, is that the bits and pieces that I absorb and read and hear and so forth, is that our medical community, our law enforcement community, our educational community, none of these are
They're all
in
opposed.
favor of legislation,
And yet the legislators,
and yet, so
what's going on?
what's happening?
I don't know. I mean, maybe those aforementioned groups need to stand up and yell to the legislators, hey, wrong, 180 degrees back
But
the way
I
you
think
came.
they have. I just think someone's not listening for
Well,
whatever.
maybe the governor needs to take the lead on this.
I think we should also be mindful that when we oppose these things, these ideas, there's the criticism that we get on the center right is that we're not compassionate and that we don't have any of our own ideas. At least they're trying. So it's very important to understand that the policies about liberalizing drug use comes from the fact that they say the war on drugs has failed. And so why not legalize? And this is kind of a push towards legalizing. And I think that, and then there are unintended consequences, but as I talked about the harm reduction, they say at least you're reducing harm to the people who are addicted, and the unintended consequences are dwarf in comparison. So it's very important for us to explain and be very clear that we have a lot of compassion for people who are addicted. And we want them to get off drugs, not buprenorphine or not substituted for some less problematic drug, but just be off it and find meaning in different ways. So, and we want to help doing that.
Yeah. Not only do we want them off it, we don't want them to start it. So we have
Yes.
to go back here and find out what is driving
Yes.
this. Why is this happening?
Yes.
And Lawrence, you mentioned the family, erosion of the family, and we know there's other, maybe it's God, maybe it's other things that various people can point their fingers to. But
This compassion thing, compassion flows from people's honest, loving hearts, and it's a wonderful thing. Some political groups have used the notion of compassion to justify all manner of political action and accuse those who oppose their compassionate acts of lacking that same compassion.
Right.
That is really duplicitous, Machiavellian manipulation. The real compassion is helping people to take stock of their lives, to utilize their God-given resources, to build themselves up in life, to seek the help they need and to build, rather than to rely on an unreliable government, which can never be as reliable as you, your family, your friends, and your support network, to do and to be all that you can be and to pull yourself out of the problems you have.
thank you, Lawrence.
As
Gail.
far as the legislators go, like so many other things that they discuss and vote on and everything, and I pose this question to like the education committee or whatever, is have they gone out to the community? Like for instance, have they gone to like a mental hospital or some place dealing with these drug addicts? Getting to and actually seeing what's happening. I can't believe that they are, but why don't they? That's one way to find out. I mean, you spend an evening or a night in an emergency room, as an example, to get a first-hand observation of what's happening. I may be overly critical, but
No, I think it's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Well, this was fantastic. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Our time has come to an end. This was a great conversation panel about healthcare in Vermont and beyond. I think we went beyond. Thank you very much, and
Pleasure.
thank you, Orca.